Dust swirled in the wind as the truck ground to a stop in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in Texas. A group of Japanese women, thin from war and silence, were marched out past barbed wire into the heart of what looked like a ranch. Inside a wooden mess hall, rows of American servicemen, cowboys by dress and by spirit, turned to stare. At the door, one woman hesitated. Her name was Emmy. She had been told that surrender meant disgrace, that Americans would spit, mock, and starve them, that they were animals in skirts, not soldiers. Then it happened. A man in boots and a wide-brimmed hat stood up. He looked at her, nodded once, and said it plainly. "She belongs at the table." Another cowboy slid over. A chair scraped back. No jeers, no laughter, just a space made for her. The moment broke everything she had believed, and what came next was even more impossible. The desert wind bit at her cheeks as the truck rumbled to a stop in front of a gate marked with signs she couldn't read. Emmy sat motionless, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, nails pressed into her palms. Around her other women stirred, nurses, clerks, auxiliaries, shadows of the Imperial Army now wrapped in worn coats and silent stares. The journey from Japan had been a blur of salt water, steel, and silence. They had been moved like cargo. Tokyo to Yokohama, across the Pacific in gray ships where their only view of the world was through cracks in the hull. Then trains, so many trains, one after another through open plains and wide, empty skies to this place in Texas where the sun felt sharper, the sky impossibly large, and the silence unbearable. As they stepped down onto red dust, the American flag above the gate flapped lazily. It was the first time Emmy had seen it up close, not on a pamphlet or a target, but real, cotton, and indifferent to her presence. The guards motioned without yelling. No barking dogs, no drawn bayonets, just hands gesturing and a few clipped words in English that sounded more like instructions than threats. The women glanced at one another, braced for humiliation. They had been trained to expect it. In Japan, surrender was not an option. It was a death sentence of the soul. Emmy had repeated the oath with the others before deployment. Better to die than be taken alive. The code of Bushido was not merely legend, it had become marrow. To be captured was to become less than human. And yet here she was, boots scraping gravel in a country she'd been told would strip her of every ounce of dignity. She tried to walk tall, though her shoulders sagged under the weight of shame. A nurse with no patience, a soldier with no weapon, a woman who had failed to die. Inside the gates, they were processed quickly. Their names were taken, uniforms replaced with rough gray work clothes, possessions catalogued and placed in boxes they might never see again. Emmy's fingers lingered on a small mirror, chipped at the corner, before it was sealed away. She didn't argue, not because she lacked the words, but because she no longer believed she deserved to keep anything. The barracks were plain but sturdy. The beds had thin mattresses, rough blankets, and more space than she'd expected. She had pictured cages. Instead, she found wood-framed structures with windows that opened. It made no sense. At roll call, a tall American with a sunburned face read names from a clipboard. He didn't leer. He didn't even look up. This, too, was strange. Indifference was somehow more confusing than cruelty. She had prepared herself to hate them. But how do you hate a man who doesn't even notice you? That night, she lay on the mattress without undressing. The room smelled faintly of soap and dust. From outside came the low murmur of male voices, American guards, laughing at something she would never understand. Not a laugh of cruelty, a real one, light and careless. It gnawed at her more than insults would have. For years, every American had been painted in her mind as a beast, a monster with blue eyes and bloodied hands. And now they laughed like brothers. In the dark, Emmy whispered a prayer to her mother. She didn't ask for freedom. She asked to survive whatever came next without losing what little honor she had left. Surrender was a wound no bandage could hide, and as she drifted into sleep, the silence of the camp stretched around her, not peaceful, not threatening, just unknown. The real war, she would soon learn, was not over. It had only just begun. It began with the scrape of a chair. That sharp, simple sound cut through the clatter of the mess hall like a gunshot, yet it brought no fear. Emmy stood frozen just inside the door, flanked by a handful of other Japanese women, their eyes low, their frames tense. The room was filled with American soldiers, some in uniform, others in dusty boots and plaid shirts that clung to sun-worn shoulders. Cowboys, they called them. Young, loud, hungry. The kind of men she had been taught would spit at her, laugh in her face, or worse. Her fingers clenched tightly around the edge of her tray. Then one of them stood. He wore a faded Stetson, tilted back on his head, and boots that creaked when he moved. He had a sunburned neck and a silver star pinned crookedly on his chest. He looked right at her, no smirk, no threat, and with a nod to the table nearest him, said it plainly. "She belongs at the table." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a kindness. It was a fact, spoken like a man telling the wind which way to blow. The other men didn't jeer. One slid over, made room. The sound of the chair moving back was deafening. Emmy didn't move. She couldn't. Her legs refused to obey. In her mind, 1,000 voices screamed at once, officers from training camps, her father's stern silence, the code of surrender equals shame. But louder than all of them was a new silence, the absence of cruelty. One of the guards nudged her forward gently, not with force, but with permission. The room watched, not in menace, just waiting. She stepped forward on legs that shook, every part of her telling her to brace for the trap. But there was none. She sat. The chair was solid wood. The table was warm from the sun, scarred with cuts and burns. Her tray clattered slightly as she placed it down. A bowl of stew, a slice of cornbread, coffee. Across from her, the cowboy who had spoken was eating slowly, one elbow on the table, head tilted in curiosity. He didn't stare. He didn't look away either. His plate was nearly identical to hers. That mattered. In a world where prisoners ate slop and soldiers ate meat, this detail was revolutionary. It said, "You are not beneath us." She tried to lower her eyes, tried to find the familiar submission that had kept her safe before. But there was no safety in that silence now. Only confusion. Her training told her this was weakness, a trap wrapped in manners. But the warmth of the stew beneath her nose said something else. The scent alone was overwhelming. Meat, salt, onion, a hint of something sweet. She hadn't smelled food like this in years. Her stomach, despite her pride, growled. A soldier a few chairs down offered a napkin with a brief glance. Another passed the salt. A third one chuckled softly when another fumbled his fork. No one mocked her. No one raised a voice. The quiet was not born of discipline, but comfort. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. Comfort. Here. She lifted her spoon with trembling fingers. The stew touched her tongue and the taste exploded. Rich, real, absurd. She couldn't breathe for a moment. Tears sprang to her eyes, unbidden, unwanted. She blinked them back. Across the table the cowboy caught her gaze. He didn't smile. He just nodded again, once, like before, as if to say, "Yes, you are allowed to feel this." For a moment, the war vanished. The camp dissolved. There was only a table, and strangers who had been enemies sharing a meal in the middle of a country she didn't understand. The seat wasn't just wood. It was a crack in her armor. A dangerous, generous, irreversible crack. She sat there, eating slowly, afraid of what it meant to feel human again. The next day, Emmy wasn't sure if it had been a dream. The chair, the cowboy, the way the food had melted her resistance more quickly than any threat ever could. But when the bell rang and the prisoners were led back to the mess hall, the memory was waiting for her like an open door. She didn't want to go. She didn't want to feel again what she had felt, that slippery mix of hunger and guilt, warmth and fear. Yet her legs moved, and the line moved with her, and soon the scent of something rich and smoky filled her nose. Inside they were served chili, thick with meat and beans, steaming with spices she couldn't name. The bread was warm and soft. There was butter, real butter, not the gray grease they had once used to fry insect-bitten rice back in Japan. The coffee was darker today, sharper, almost bitter. It burned her tongue in a way that made her throat tighten. And again, no one yelled, no one laughed, no one mocked. The Americans ate alongside them, chatting among themselves, oblivious to the emotional earthquakes happening across the table. Emmy took her seat slowly. Around her, the others followed suit. Some had adjusted quicker than others. One woman, older, with a scar above her eye, ate with rigid posture and eyes fixed on the wall, as if forcing herself not to enjoy it. Another whispered a prayer before taking her first bite. And across from Emmy, a girl who could not have been more than 18 lifted her spoon, tasted the stew, and began to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just tears slipping down her face, soundless, steady, soaking the front of her collar as she kept eating. No one said anything. The Americans noticed but didn't interfere. That, too, was unsettling. Their silence wasn't cold. It was respectful, as if they somehow knew this wasn't just food. It was a confrontation with pride, with memory, with belief. Because while their stomachs were finally full, their hearts were being emptied of certainty. What were they supposed to do with this sudden absence of cruelty? What were they to believe, now that the enemy fed them with the same hands they once thought would torture them? At night, Emmy lay in her bunk, listening to the soft breaths of women trying to sleep. One of them clutched a small cloth pouch to her chest, filled with crumbs of cornbread she hadn't eaten. Another had hidden a chocolate square in her shoe, convinced it would be taken from her or used against her. The guards had offered those sweets freely. That was the problem. The kindness wasn't forced, it wasn't transactional, and that made it more terrifying. One girl, a radio operator from Osaka, whispered that she hadn't eaten the peanut butter she was given, said it tasted strange, foreign, maybe poisoned. She spat it out the moment the guard turned his back and flushed it down the toilet. The others nodded, not because they agreed, but because they understood. Trust was not something they were trained to give. It had been stripped from them before they ever left home. But even fear has limits, and as the days turned into weeks, hunger chipped away at ideology. The stew was too rich to ignore, the bread too soft, the coffee too warm on cold mornings. It wasn't propaganda, it was sensation, and sensation spoke a language older than loyalty. Emmy found herself waking each day no longer afraid of being beaten, but afraid of how much she had started to want the food. The warmth, the quiet, the absence of hatred. Each kindness she received, each folded napkin, each nod from a guard, was a small, careful wedge splitting her from everything she had believed. And as she lay awake one night, the taste of chili still on her tongue, she wondered, If the enemy treats us like people, who lied to us? The next morning, the guards brought out boxes filled with paper, envelopes, and stubby pencils worn down to half their length. They placed them on the long wooden table in the common area and said something in slow, careful English. One word Emmy understood clearly: right. Another followed, softer, almost strange in this place of fences and watchtowers: home. A wave of stillness swept through the room. For a long moment no one moved. The women sat there, paralyzed, staring at the paper like it was a landmine. Home. The very word seemed foreign now, both a longing and a betrayal. What could they possibly say? And why would the Americans allow it? Surely there was a catch. Surely the letters would be burned or used as bait. One woman muttered that the guards wanted them to reveal secrets. Another whispered that the envelopes were poisoned with invisible powder. Paranoia still clung to them like dust. But the guards didn't push. They simply left the supplies there and stepped back. No demands, no instructions, just the silent invitation to speak. Emmy sat down slowly, the pencil cold in her hand. Her fingers trembled. The last time she'd held a writing instrument was to document blood loss in a field hospital during an air raid. Now she stared at the blank paper and saw not space, but weight. Every word would mean something. Every sentence might betray someone. But staying silent, after all she had felt, all she had tasted, seemed worse. So she wrote 5 words. They fed me. I cried. She stared at the sentence for a long time, unsure whether it was too much or not enough. It was the only truth she could say without breaking apart. Around her, others began to write too, hesitantly at first. One woman asked for the Japanese characters for safe. Another traced her mother's name over and over before finally beginning. The pencils moved like slow streams, carving their way through disbelief. The letters were collected days later, sealed and stamped with American postmarks, addressed in the clumsy, heartfelt handwriting of women caught between two worlds. They were handed to a translator, then sent through official channels, but not to the families, not directly. In Tokyo, in the smoke-filled rooms of military censors, those letters arrived, and what they found inside was not code or confession, but something far more dangerous: gratitude, confusion, warm beds and hot meals, laughter and stew. The letters contradicted every poster, every slogan, every horror story the Empire had ever told about American brutality. One official reportedly read Emmy's words twice. They fed me. I cried. Then set the page down without a word. Some letters were blocked, others were quietly filed away, unreadable by the families they were meant for. A few slipped through, and the ones that did found mothers who wept at the kitchen table, fathers who refused to believe, and younger siblings who stared wide-eyed at the notion that their captured sister might be living better than they were. The contradictions rippled outward, unsettling everyone they touched. Back in the camp, the women waited. Weeks passed. No replies came, no confirmation, only silence. But something had shifted. They had spoken, and that act, small as it was, began to change them. Emmy found herself returning to that moment with the pencil often. She didn't know what she had expected, but it wasn't the ache she felt now. To be treated well by the enemy was harder to bear than cruelty. At least cruelty made sense. Kindness. Kindness tore everything apart. She kept writing even when she wasn't allowed, on scraps, on the backs of ration lists, inside the margins of old books. She didn't know if anyone would ever read her words, but she needed them to exist, because being cared for by the enemy wasn't just confusing, it was unbearable. And it was the truth. When the assignments were posted outside the barracks, Emmy didn't expect her name. Most of the women had settled into kitchen duty or laundry work, safely hidden behind fences and canvas. But next to her name was a word she barely understood: agriculture. A young guard, freckled and gangly, pointed toward a flatbed truck waiting at the edge of camp. Emmy hesitated. Leaving the fence felt like walking off a cliff, but she followed. The drive was short. Through fields dotted with mesquite trees and barbed wire fences, they arrived at a farm, not a military base, not a prison labor site, but a working ranch. Red dust kicked up with every step. Rows of crops stretched into the horizon, neatly plowed and marked. Cows grazed lazily nearby, and beyond them, the cowboys. They weren't actors, not the kind she'd seen on stolen American postcards back in the barracks. These men were real: boots scuffed, shirts rolled to the elbow, hats shading weathered faces. They worked the land like it was stitched into their skin. One rode past on a horse, reins loose in hand, nodding at Emmy as he passed like she was just another person standing in the dirt. It wasn't pity, it wasn't mockery, it was worse. It was normal. The rhythm of the farm was familiar. Emmy remembered her grandfather's land in the mountains near Nagano. Before the war, before the uniforms and sirens, she had spent summers pulling weeds and harvesting rice, her knees caked in mud, her hands brown with sun and effort. This field in Texas was different, dry, open, humming with insects, but the feeling was the same: working under the sky, breathing air that didn't taste like metal. Her task was simple: water rows of newly planted beans with a metal can. The cowboy who handed it to her smiled slightly, then pointed to the rows. No English, no lecture, just a gesture that said, "Go on." She did. At first she worked mechanically, eyes on the soil, heart behind armor, but over the days something loosened. The cowboy with the horse, his name, she later learned, was Roy, often passed her on his rounds. He'd tip his hat. Once he handed her a handkerchief when sweat dripped into her eyes. She didn't thank him. She couldn't, but she kept the cloth, washed it, folded it. It lived in her cot like a relic. Another time, as she wiped dirt from her hands, one of the younger men offered her a cold bottle of something dark and fizzy. She recoiled at first. He laughed, not unkindly, and took a sip to show it wasn't poison. Then he handed it to her again. She drank. It burned her throat and made her eyes water, but she finished every drop. They didn't treat her like a prisoner, not like an enemy. They treated her like someone who belonged there, a laborer, a woman, a person. The horses fascinated her most, powerful, silent, knowing. She watched them as they moved with a grace that didn't belong in a war-torn world. Once Roy let her pet the muzzle of his mare. The horse snorted, softly, warm breath against her wrist. Emmy's hand lingered there, stunned by the moment's gentleness. No one called her by name, but they saw her, and after months of invisibility, of being just another shameful body tucked behind barbed wire, that simple recognition shook her. One evening, as the truck returned to camp, she looked out across the open land. The fields blurred with the heat, the sky turning to fire as the sun sank. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was in a prison. She felt like she had crossed into a place neither enemy nor ally. Just earth, just sky, just a woman with dirt on her hands and something fragile beginning to stir inside her. That fragile thing followed her back into camp each evening, lingering like a warmth she wasn't sure she was allowed to feel. The sun dipped behind the barracks, leaving streaks of gold across the sky, and the air cooled enough that Emmy could finally breathe without tasting dust. She washed her hands in a metal basin, the water turning brown as it swirled around her fingers, and that was when the music usually started. A harmonica, thin, reedy, wavering at first, floated through the camp like a wandering spirit. Someone sitting on a porch step, or leaning against a wooden post, or resting beneath a flickering lantern, would lift the tiny instrument to his lips and let the notes drift out. The melodies were simple, almost childlike, tunes that spoke of homes somewhere far from Texas, of mothers who cooked Sunday suppers, of long roads and slow summers, and lives untouched by war. At first, Emmy tried to ignore it. The music stirred too many things inside her, memories of festival drums in Nagano, of bamboo flutes played by old men in the village square, of childhood nights filled with laughter before the world had turned so sharp. She couldn't afford those memories now. They were dangerous. But the sound came every night, persistent and patient, and soon the women sat quietly in the barracks, listening despite themselves. One evening, as the sky deepened into violet, the harmonica shifted into a melody Emmy had never heard before. Soft, slow, the kind of tune that made the heart lean forward to listen. Another cowboy joined in with a second harmonica, their notes weaving together like threads in a new fabric. The guards nearby chuckled at something one of them said, but even they fell into a kind of reverent quiet as the music deepened. It was then that something unbearable happened. A Japanese woman, Yuki, barely older than 18, began to hum. Not loudly, not confidently, just a fragile line of sound, trembling like a moth's wing. Emmy's breath froze. The others stiffened too, because joy, any spark of it, felt like treason, like turning your face away from the ruins of your homeland, like letting the enemy rewrite the story the emperor had carved into their bones. But the humming didn't stop. It grew steadier, warmer, shaped by a voice that had forgotten what it meant to sing. The nearest cowboy heard it, paused his playing, then smiled, not with mockery, not with surprise, but with something that looked like gratitude. He adjusted his tune, matched her rhythm, softened to her pitch. The two sounds, a harmonica and a young woman's humming, met in the middle of the darkened yard, suspended above barbed wire, above uniforms and borders and shame. Laughter broke the spell, not cruel, but startled, delighted, disbelieving. Some of the Japanese women pressed hands over their mouths as if afraid the guards might punish them. But the guards only watched, smiling faintly, leaning against the fence posts with the easy posture of men who recognized a small miracle when it unfolded in front of them. And in that moment the lines blurred, not fully, not in a way anyone would dare name, but for a heartbeat the war loosened its grip. The enemy became simply men with tired eyes and calloused hands. The prisoners became women who had once belonged to festivals and rice fields, and families who loved them. Humanness seeped through the cracks, uninvited, unstoppable. Emmy felt it most sharply when Roy, the cowboy with the horse, lifted his harmonica and played a soft, lilting refrain that sounded suspiciously like a lullaby. The tune wrapped around her like the warmth of an old blanket, like something she had forgotten she'd lost until it returned. She clenched her fists. Joy was dangerous. Joy meant remembering life before the war. Joy meant wondering what else had been a lie. But as the melody carried across the night, echoing through the barracks and settling into the dust like a whispered truth, Emmy understood something she had never allowed herself to consider. The enemy was not supposed to make her feel anything at all. And yet, here she was, listening, breathing, and, for the first time in years, letting the smallest spark of something tender settle carefully into the hollow places inside her. The next morning, the tenderness became something far heavier. The guards called the women out to the yard, where a truck sat loaded with folded bundles, thick woolen blankets stacked like bricks of muted color. At first, Emmy thought they were supplies for the guards, or for repairs, or perhaps another farming tool she would be expected to haul. But then the officer began reading names. One by one, each woman stepped forward and was handed a blanket. Not borrowed, not rationed, given. When her name was called, Emmy froze. She didn't move until the guard repeated it, slower, adding a polite gesture with his hand. She stepped forward stiffly and accepted the blanket the way one might accept a sword blade, gingerly, afraid of the cut. It was soft. Too soft. Not the coarse military-issue fabric she had grown used to in Japan, the kind that itched through uniforms and collected the smell of sweat and mud. This blanket was warm, thick, reassuring in a way she didn't want to understand. It felt like something a mother would tuck around a child during winter. Something meant to protect, something meant to comfort. And suddenly, it felt heavier than any weapon she had ever carried. Shame hit her first, sharp, immediate, acidic. She hadn't earned this. She wasn't supposed to have warmth or softness or anything remotely close to kindness. Back home, soldiers slept on floors. Hospitals rationed heat. Civilians froze in bombed-out basements. She had wrapped wounded men in paper-thin cloth during the worst days of the war, praying they would survive the night. Some didn't. She had watched frost claim fingers, watched breath turn shallow and slow. Why then, why was she standing here in Texas with a blanket so soft it could have belonged to a child in a house untouched by war? Back in the barracks, the other women opened their blankets like Christmas gifts they didn't quite trust. Yuki stroked hers with trembling hands before pressing her nose into it, inhaling the faint scent of detergent and sun. Another woman folded hers neatly and placed it at the foot of her bed as if afraid to disturb it. The older women were more hesitant, holding the blankets like fragile things that might disappear if they blinked too hard. Emmy sat on her bunk, staring at hers, unable to touch it again. The softness mocked her. It whispered that she had been wrong, that everything she had believed, every warning, every oath, every lecture drilled into her skull, was unraveling, thread by thread. Dignity was not supposed to feel like this. It was supposed to come from sacrifice, from silent obedience, from death if needed. But here, dignity slipped quietly into her hands in the form of a blanket. It was given without condition, without cruelty, without even eye contact. A kindness so casual it bordered on revolutionary. She hated it, because kindness could change a person in ways brutality never could. Brutality made sense. This, warmth, softness, a good night's sleep, this was reprogramming her from the inside out. She felt it. Every time she wrapped her hands around a mug of hot coffee, every time the soap lathered easily on her skin, every time she slid between clean sheets that smelled faintly of starch and sun, something inside her shifted a fraction. That night, she forced herself to sleep without the blanket. She lay on the thin mattress, arms crossed, staring at the wooden ceiling. But the cold crept in. The air grew sharper as the hours passed, and eventually, shivering, she reached for the blanket and pulled it around her shoulders. It didn't feel like surrender. It didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like being human. And that terrified her more than the cold ever could. That night, beneath the safety of the blanket she had once feared, Emmy whispered into the stillness, "If the enemy sees me as human, who was I fighting for?" Her voice was barely more than breath, but the silence in the bunkhouse cracked like porcelain. No one answered, no one needed to. The question hung in the air, too dangerous to acknowledge, too honest to ignore. Around her, the women shifted in their beds. Some feigned sleep, others stared at the ceiling, their faces turned toward darkness. But in their stillness, Emmy felt it, the slow, quiet unraveling of certainty. The war was supposed to be simple. Us versus them, good versus evil, honor versus humiliation. And yet the enemy brought soup and soap. The enemy played lullabies on harmonicas and handed out blankets that didn't itch. Doubt crept in silently, like the cold once had. It didn't arrive in grand revelations, but in smaller, subtler betrayals of belief. A soft word from a guard, a shared glance across a row of crops, the warm scent of bread carried on the wind. Every small kindness cracked the walls they had built around themselves. And now, Emmy had spoken the unspeakable. The idea that dignity could come from the hands of those they were taught to hate was not just radical, it was treason, yet it was happening. Every single day, the camp, once feared as a place of punishment, had become something else entirely. Not a haven, but not a hell either. A place of in-betweens where lines blurred and truths no longer held their shape. Honor, real honor, began to change meaning. It was no longer the stiff-backed silence they'd been taught to perform. It was not found in death, in martyrdom, or in the denial of comfort. It emerged in the way they held themselves at breakfast, in the cautious laughter that sometimes slipped between bites of cornbread, in the way they washed their own sheets because they were clean and worth keeping that way. There was dignity in being seen, not as tools, not as shameful reminders of a failed mission, but as people, women, survivors. For Emmy, this shift came into sharp focus one morning when she helped carry water buckets for an elderly guard who had slipped on loose gravel. He winced as he stood, waved her off, muttered something under his breath, but she stayed. Together they carried the load to the far end of the field. Not a word passed between them, but when she turned to walk back, he tipped his hat, not out of condescension, not out of obligation. It was respect, quiet and plain. She remembered wondering if she had ever received such a gesture back home, from a superior, from anyone. That night, as the harmonica began again, softer than usual, a sense of calm settled into the bunkhouse. Not peace, not yet, but something that resembled it, fragile and quiet, like a truce not signed on paper but etched into the small acts of decency that unfolded when no one was watching. The women didn't talk about the question Emmy had asked. They didn't have to. It hovered like dust in the rafters. It echoed in every silence that followed a kind gesture. And as each day passed, more and more of them began to feel what Emmy had whispered out loud. They were changing, not all at once, not without fear, but something deep inside, the thing that had kept them loyal, unquestioning, hardened, was softening. And it was that softness, that rediscovery of their own worth, that might be the most dangerous thing of all. If you've made it this far and you're moved by this story, like the video and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. The letter home had been folded so many times it looked like worn linen. Emmy kept it tucked in the pocket of her uniform as she stepped up the ramp of the repatriation ship, the Texas sun warming the back of her neck one final time. Her hands clutched the blanket, not because it was cold, but because she didn't want to let it go. It was the last thing that made sense anymore, a symbol of something she couldn't explain, a memory she didn't want to forget. The war was over. That's what the guards had said. The women would be sent back. Home, they called it. But the word felt strange on Emmy's tongue, as if it belonged to a place she no longer understood. Still, she smiled when she had to, nodded when asked, and boarded the ship like a proper citizen. Obedient, silent. The ocean voyage was long and quiet. No one spoke much. Some women clutched keepsakes, an empty coffee tin, a photograph, even a harmonica. Others kept nothing, as if trying to erase the confusion of the past months by force. But for Emmy, erasure wasn't an option. The kindness she had been shown couldn't be forgotten. It had soaked into her too deeply, altered her too completely. When the Japanese coastline came into view, Emmy's heart thudded, not with joy, but with dread. The port was broken, smoke still clung to the outskirts. Her hometown, once a quiet grid of wooden homes and market stalls, was half rubble, half silence. And the people who remained didn't look like survivors. They looked like ghosts who had forgotten how to speak. She walked through streets that no longer felt familiar. Her shoes kicked up dust from bomb craters. Children with hollow eyes stared at her blanket. Her uniform marked her as a returnee, and the stares she received were not of relief or welcome, but suspicion. What had she seen? What had she done? What had been done to her? When she reached her family's home, or what was left of it, her mother opened the door with eyes that looked older than her face. There was no dramatic embrace, just silence. Emmy stepped inside. The rooms were smaller than she remembered. Her brother was gone. The neighbors were gone. Her childhood bed was now a shelf for rice sacks. At dinner she offered to help cook, but her mother insisted. The food was thin, mostly roots and broth. Her hands reflexively searched for salt that wasn't there. She didn't complain. She chewed quietly. But her tongue missed the flavor of chili. Her body remembered bacon grease. Her heart ached for the sound of harmonicas drifting through dry Texas air. Her mother asked, "Did they hurt you?" Emmy paused. "No," she said, eyes on the soup. "They gave us blankets." Her mother said nothing, just nodded. But Emmy could feel it, the discomfort, the unspoken accusation. Kindness from the enemy did not fit into the story Japan was trying to tell itself. Days passed. She walked through her old village, through familiar alleys now marked by loss. And everywhere she went, she felt like a stranger. Her thoughts came in two languages now. Her memories were split between two worlds, and her heart carried guilt for surviving so well while others had not. She wrote in her journal late one night, "I came home, but the girl they expect isn't the woman I've become." She did not mention the cowboy who said she belonged at the table. She did not speak of music or soap or laughter in the fields. Some things she understood were too heavy for a country still trying to remember how to stand. But each night, before bed, she folded her American blanket carefully, laid it over her thin futon, and rested her head on a world that had once been called the enemy, and now lived quietly, irrevocably, inside her. Decades later, the blanket had faded to a color that didn't quite have a name, somewhere between the dust of Texas and the ash of Tokyo. Emmy kept it in a cedar chest, folded with the care usually reserved for heirlooms. But the photograph stayed out. It stood in a small wooden frame on the highest shelf in her modest Tokyo apartment, a black and white image of a young cowboy, half smiling beside a horse, the brim of his hat tilted just so. Most visitors didn't ask about it. Some assumed it was a relic from a film or an odd piece of Americana collected along the way. But one day, her granddaughter, barefoot and curious, pointed to it after lunch and asked plainly, "Who's that, Obachan?" Emmy paused, her fingers wrapped around a teacup. The room was quiet, the clink of dishes replaced by the stillness of memory. She looked at the photo, then at her granddaughter, and she said gently, "Because he reminded me I was human." The child blinked. "Wasn't that always true?" Emmy smiled, a small, sad smile. "Not to everyone." There were things she had never spoken of, things too complicated for words, too sacred for casual conversation. But moments like this were bridges, small ones, just enough to carry a piece of truth across a generational gap. She didn't tell the whole story. She didn't mention the mess hall or the music or the field where the horses grazed under a wide American sky. But she remembered it all, because memory, she had learned, was a kind of resistance. She had lived through a time when truth was rewritten, when silence was survival. But the memory of one cowboy's kindness, just a sentence, just a gesture, had carved out a space inside her that propaganda could never touch. He had looked at her, not as a prisoner, not as an enemy, but as a person, a woman with dirt on her hands and fear in her bones. And he had said, "She belongs at the table." That moment echoed louder with every passing year. In a world still spinning from war, from walls and flags and declarations, that simple act had been revolutionary. A declaration of humanity, a choice to see, not stereotype, and Emmy had carried that choice with her quietly, like a lantern kept hidden but always lit. Sometimes she wondered if the cowboy had known what he'd done, if he had gone back to his ranch and forgotten her name, her face, the brief chapter she'd occupied in his life. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that the act had happened. It had shaped her, saved her, in ways bullets and surrender never could. Now, at this table, surrounded by children who had never known the hunger of war or the sting of exile, Emmy understood the weight of that seat. Not just the one offered to her in Texas, but the one she had built for herself here, across time and loss and memory. She poured her granddaughter another cup of tea. "Sometimes kindness is the most radical thing a person can do," she said. The child nodded, as if this made sense in a way only the young can grasp so easily. The photo stayed on the shelf. Not because of nostalgia, but because of truth. Because it reminded Emmy that survival wasn't just about living, it was about being seen. And being seen, truly, was how healing began. She belonged at the table. She always had. It had just taken a cowboy, a camp, and a war to remind her. If this story moved you, like this video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We read every one.